starting to slow down. So I might get started with my introductions, and I'm sure further people will join us as they log on. So hello, everyone. My name is Alexis Tyndall. I'm the Manager of Digital Innovation here at the University of Adelaide Library, and welcome to our webinar for today. Before I start, I'd like to acknowledge that I live and work on the lands of the Kaurna people, and I acknowledge and pay my respects to them as the traditional custodians whose ancestral lands we gather on, even virtually today. I acknowledge the deep feelings of attachment and relationship of the Kaurna people to country, and we respect and value their past, present and ongoing connection to land and cultural beliefs. At least one of our speakers today is joining us from Canberra, and there may be people beaming in from elsewhere online. So I extend that respect to relevant communities in other regions and any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people who are present today. With that, welcome to the fourth webinar in the 21 series of the University Library's Digital Humanities Lab. The objective of this series of webinars and in-person events has been to showcase digitally innovative work that the University of Adelaide and that is happening at the University of Adelaide, and encourage and inspire researchers and students interested in using digital methods and tools to help make them aware of the resources that are available to them, where possible, support a bit of peer learning across our community, and facilitate networking that may, in the best case, lead to interdisciplinary collaboration. As you are someone who's registered for this webinar, I'm going to add you to my circulation list for further events. Please feel free to email me and opt out at any time. So I gave today's title as New Approaches, and we have a slightly diverse set of speakers today, but there are a couple of threads that link them together. We'll be hearing from researchers who are using machine learning to consider sources like Latin poetry and social media, and a couple who are using social media to think about information flow and examining the manifestation of emotion online. It should be a really interesting session. Before we start, just a little bit of housekeeping. Today's session will be recorded and shared after the event on the University of Adelaide YouTube page. If you have any questions, please look to the bottom of your screen and you'll find a chat button, and you can ask your questions in that chat window, or feel free to introduce yourself and where you're coming in from. Those questions can be sent through at any time, and I will collect those questions and pose them to our speakers in the closing section of our webinar. So I will try to keep that brief. Housekeeping done, I'm going to introduce our first speaker, who is Ben Nagy from our own School of Humanities here at the University of Adelaide. Ben recently completed an MPhil by publication in Classics, producing 3 papers, all of which are published or in press. Before returning to study, he worked for several years as a researcher in cybersecurity, and very recently has started a PhD with a stylometry team in Krakow, Poland. And with that, I will hand over to Ben, and we'll see you after his presentation.
G'day. I'm going to start us off with an ancient mystery. It's not as exciting as Name of the Rose, but it does literally have monasteries on top of hills and lost manuscripts and monks and a papal schism. So we start in 1417. So there's this guy, Poggio, and he's a papal secretary to one of the popes, because there are 2 popes right now, long story. And he is attending a very, very long conference in Switzerland. And so for his hobby, what he does is he goes around to monasteries and he finds lost Latin texts. So in 1417, he finds a text called the Punica by Caelius Italicus. That's the longest Latin epic that we have in 17 books. He finds it, we don't exactly know, maybe in the St. Gallen monastery, and takes a copy or maybe 2 copies, we don't know, and then sends them off to Italy. This is while he's all doing sort of papal schism stuff. So now there's a copy of this manuscript. So the manuscript that was copied is the only source for every copy we now have of the text of this poem. And of course, it has since been lost. Around the middle of the 15th century then, we get a scholar called Calderini. The Italian humanists were hugely interested in Latin literature of all kinds, and the Punica caused a really big stir. They knew that it existed, but they didn't have it until now. So at some point, Calderini is reading this thing and he's like, oh, there's some stuff missing. So there's a bit in book 8 where there's a gap. And he reckoned that there were about 50 verses that, like 50 lines, he means, that needed to be added. And conveniently, he wrote down exactly what should be in those missing 50 lines. But then, just at the start of the 16th century, this guy, Jacobius Constantius, releases an edition of just like a bunch of essays, a bunch of Latin critical essays. And in that, he says, basically, I've got some bits that were missing from Celius. And that missing bit in book 8, my old mate, Baptista Gorani, who also taught me Latin, he sent me these 82 verses that fill in the gap, and they're totally legit, I swear. Very, very interesting. So they've just turned up, from Gallia, but they do the job, as in they tell the story that needs to be told to fill in this gap in the poem. And then around 1523, this guy, Assulanus, who's a hugely important publisher, published editions of many classical works. So he brings out an edition of the Punica, which includes 81 lines that fill in this gap in book 8. And he doesn't say where he got them, but it's almost certain that he ripped them off from old Constantius. So now, when we get to the modern age, so what's happened? There was one source manuscript, we've lost it. There were some copies, we've lost them. And we've got 81 suspect lines that have been in every single edition of the poem. The modern scholarship starts with a guy called Heitland. He writes an important paper on the great lacuna, and he reckons they're genuine, but he reckons it for a kind of a weird reason. Heitland's general opinion, and the opinion of most of the 19th and 20th century scholars, is that Celius is no good. And because, they pretty much hate everything except Virgil. And so he's like, oh, look, this is pretty bad, but Celius is pretty bad, so whatever, they're probably genuine. In particular, one of the claims that I wanted to test was this thing, which is many of the commentators that doubt the lines say, oh, look, these are too slavishly Virgilian. It looks like a ripoff that's been made by a guy that wants to fill in the gap. And he's just read up on his Virgil. And so it's like a whole bunch of reworked Virgilian lines that have been sort of mushed together to just like fill in this story gap. But Heitland thinks, oh no, I mean, nothing can be too servile for Celius. Again, because he reckons Celius is bad. And so that's where we are. The scholarship hasn't significantly moved on this since the late 20th century. Some Italians wrote a long but fairly disordered article claiming that the lines are genuine. Most scholars, when I was coming in, the balance of opinion is that the lines are probably not genuine. All of the argument until now has been based on literary stuff, like this line, these words. So my thing was, all right, let's see if we can do some numbers to it. So what is stylometry? The idea is that every author, or every artist really, leaves unconscious fingerprints in their work, and we can measure them. So in theory, we're doing objective, repeatable science. But you can't just go and, computer everything and say, oh, machine learning says that this is an outlier, therefore Ovid didn't write the Metamorphoses, because you'll just get laughed out of the academy. So I still needed to do like a proper classics degree so that I can understand what's going on with the poem from a literary point of view as well. But that's not what we're talking about today. Today, we're talking about the science stuff. And so what can we do? How can we take a multi-pronged approach to test the authenticity of these lines. The first thing I wanted to look at was this idea of servility. And how we do it is there is an existing tool, so I didn't write this one, which compares lines from the Aeneid with lines of the Punica, and looks for lines that share content words, so share load-bearing words, not like if and but and whatever. And a line that shares two or more important words with a Virgilian line is like possibly a reworking. Whether it is a real reworking or not, for my purposes, doesn't matter. The point is that we can measure how many of the lines in Celius look like a Virgilian line that's been shuffled round. So for every chunk of 81 lines, I can get a servility index, if you like, and I can graph that on a rolling window through the book. So this is every overlapping chunk of 81 lines in the entire poem. So it's 15,000 lines in the poem, and looking at how much does this bit of the poem imitate, well, not arguably imitate Virgil? How much of this resembles known Virgilian lines? And it turns out that the Additamentum is markedly more slavish or more servile than all of the rest of the poem. This is a strong result. So 3 standard deviations, for those of you that like your stats, indicates that like the p-value is somewhere under 0.001, which is a significant result. But the picture really tells the story, right? So we get to book 8, and then, you know, it's a bit Virgilian because in this part of the poem, we're telling a story that's related to Dido. So you would expect some more Virgilianness, but measurably more so, which backs up what the traditional literary scholars thought. So their intuition was that there's more Virgilian reworking. That intuition is tested with numbers. So, okay, so there's one thing suggesting not genuine. Certainly more slavish use of Virgil. Another common thing that people do is we look at the lexicogrammatical style. So what does that mean? It means that we take words and break them up into little chunks, and we count the frequency of all of the different little chunks. This means that if an author has a tendency to use a certain lexicon, then we'll see that in the results, and they'll cluster together. For a cluster analysis, if you're not familiar, this picture is incredibly well separated. So what this says is that this pieces of words technique is a very effective way of identifying authorship. The authors have a distinctive style when measured by the word chunks that they like. And we can see that the Additamentum sits in terms of style over in the Virgil. So Virgil is the sort of blue circle. So I'm going to CSI enhance that region. So the bits that are labeled 816 and 897, those are the bits that are nearest to the Additamentum, which is the questionable bit. Whereas the Additamentum itself, in terms of its lexicogrammatical style, is way more Virgilian than anything else in Celius. We need to be careful with this technique because it can be influenced by the topic of the poem. And I don't want to get into it, but that's why there's some stuff in book 14, which is attracted over towards Lucan, because they discuss a sea battle. And so, but those book 14 ones don't get put in like right into the Lucan cluster. So again, in terms of the lexicogrammatical style, this tells me that the Additamentum is much more like Virgilian use, Virgilian grammar, Virgilian words than most of the rest of Celius. It's a pretty strong outlier. Okay, the last thing we can measure, and this is a thing that no one else does, because it's a poem, there's a whole bunch of metrical style that we can measure. For Latin poetry, all of the little things that we're looking at, so all of these little red lines, which are kinds of word breaks, kinds of pauses, all of these little foot patterns, all of the squiggly lines, they're all metrical features that we can measure. So Latin poetry is a quantity meter. So it's not written specifically to rhyme, but it's written so that these quantity patterns have to meet certain requirements, again, which I won't go into. So by measuring the metrical features, I ignore the words, and by hypothesis, I get more of a stylistic signal because it's not moved as much by what the poem is about. And it's also less under the author's conscious control. Like it's an instinct that they have when they write. So when I did the same thing with the metrical features, and I'm actually not going to talk much to this slide, we'd find that there are certain kinds of technical Latin poetic features that are used very unusually in the disputed chunk, the Additamentum, compared to the rest of Celius. And of course, because it's got a super low p-value, that means it's like good science. Again, graphing that in the same way by metrical weirdness, we see again the Additamentum being one of two very strong outliers from the rest of the poem. No time for that. So what have I done? I've measured three different kinds of style, three different things which would be stylistic fingerprints, and measuring quite different things. In all three terms, the computational analysis strongly supports the scholars who believe that the lines are not genuine. It's a stylistic outlier in all three terms. And so this is actually a pretty cool result. So the paper's written up and it's been sent off to CQ, who have it's in press there. And so they think it's a pretty important result as well. I guess that the TLDR for everyone that's not doing Latin poetry is that whatever, if you're studying any kind of literature or any kind of art, these kinds of multivariate quantitative methods can be a very powerful way when combined with actual scholarly intuition to add to debates on literary questions. The main thing is like to, make sure that we know what we're measuring and that we're asking the right question. So this was a lot of fun. This was pretty much a 1.5-year project and I loved it. We're not doing questions now. We're doing them at the end, but that's my deets if anyone wants to hassle me. And thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Ben. Yeah, so feel free to ask questions if you like. You can ask them in the chat window now, and I'll put them to Ben at the end of the session. So if you wouldn't mind stopping sharing your screen, Ben, and I'll introduce Cynthia. So next up, we've got Cynthia Shute, a PhD student in interdisciplinary and cross-cultural research at the Centre for Digital Humanities Research in the Research School of Humanities and the Arts at the Australian National University. That is quite a long title. Cynthia's research interests include collecting and analysing cross-cultural and multilingual digital content from various online platforms, and she's worked in social media mourning and online death research for some years. Her PhD investigates the use of machine learning and natural language processing techniques for detecting suicide ideation in the online environment. And with that, I will hand over to Cynthia. Thank you.
So thanks, Alexis, and hello, everyone. I'm Cynthia, a PhD student from the Centre for Digital Humanities Research at the Australian National University. The project that I'm going to share with you today is Crying Machine, automatically detecting suicide ideation in the online environment. I would like to give everybody a heads up that this presentation will talk about suicide. The research agenda at the center of this project is based on the question, can our understanding of the human grief process be successfully employed to automatically detect suicidal thoughts from content posted online? Knowledge series and analysis methods from psychology and sociology area offer the opportunity to understand the risk markers related to suicide ideation. In the computer science area, the field of artificial intelligence called natural language processing and machine learning techniques provide the tools to model the indicators. And shout out to my amazing supervisory panel. My chair, Dr. Turhi Numiko Fuller from Center for Digital Humanities Research, my associate supervisor, Dr. Jenny Davis from School of Sociology, Dr. Bernardo Pereira Nunes from College of Engineering and Computer Science, and Associate Professor Alison Collier from Center for Mental Health Research. Their expertise and generous support equipped me for constructing this project. Suicide is a leading cause of death worldwide. In particular, recent studies modeled the effect of the pandemic on suicide rates and predicted that there would be an increase ranging from 1% to 145%. The latest studies also demonstrated that 1 in 10 of the 634 deaths in Victoria, Australia was linked to COVID-19 stress. And the suicide rate increased rapidly during the second COVID-19 outbreak in Japan. More importantly, even before the pandemic, according to the WHO data, close to 800,000 people die by suicide every year, which is 1 person every 40 seconds. This means during this presentation, someone in the world died by suicide. And in Australia, 9 Australians die every day by suicide. That's more than double the road toll. Considerable efforts are directed at early detection and prevention of suicide risk. Although the traditional methods such as professional interviews, clinical judgments, and self-report questionnaires have been widely used with high validity, they still have some disadvantages. For example, they might not identify real-time changes in a person's ideation, and the sample size is limited. Research also finds that people with suicide ideation often have low motivation to seek professional help, and taking a suicide assessment may lead to negative effects. The online methods, therefore, might be more effective. During the lockdowns, there has been a surge in social media usage. Even before the pandemic, online users already frequently published posts disclosing their suicidal thoughts and plans. Taking advantage of the openness, speed, and coverage of social media, suicide ideation can be detected in real time. Importantly, studies have proved that social media content includes technical jargon or official diagnosis indicative of suicide ideation. In all, applying online data for suicide ideation detection is time, labor, and money saving. To construct a robust and reliable methodology for carrying out this project, I conducted a systematic review that focuses on summarizing the methods for detecting suicide ideation in the online environment. This systematic review has been accepted by IEEE. It extracted more than 2,200 articles based on search strings built around the keywords suicide, detect, and online. I finally selected 48 related studies and summarized their method. Based on the systematic review, I have developed a 4-step method for this project. That is data collection, data preprocessing, feature extraction, and machine learning modeling. According to the systematic review, the most popular platforms for collecting data were Twitter, Weibo, and Reddit. Hundreds of million people are using Twitter. It is a free social media platform. People can use it to interact in real time. Most Twitter accounts are public, allowing anyone to view their content via web interface, SMS, or mobile devices. It is available in almost all countries. With the huge amount of emotion-related information, there might be very tangible ways to leverage Twitter data to proactively identify people at risk. However, the 140-character limitation on tweets might reduce the capacity to accurately detect suicidal thoughts through users' expressions, as it forces people to use short and informal language. Moreover, Twitter data is noisy, contains a broad range of topics, and the language use varies over time. These features arguably make the task of detecting suicide ideation on Twitter more complex. Studies also collected data from Weibo. However, since the current project only focuses on English expressions, I will leave the analysis on Weibo as an important future work. Like Twitter, Reddit is also a trendy choice. However, Reddit is quite different from Twitter. First, Reddit does not have a character limit. According to previous studies, suicidal individuals may need longer space to express themselves. Plus, longer posts naturally can be identified correctly. Moreover, Reddit has special sections for discussion of suicidal ideas. At this point, using Reddit data could be more effective. But it is also worth mentioning that the communication and the interaction styles are totally different between Twitter and Reddit. For example, Reddit users are fully anonymous. Previous studies suggest that users show different behavior when posting anonymously, with both positive and negative effects. And regarding the collecting strategy, generally, there are two kinds of methods that have been employed by previous studies. First, directly collecting data from suicidality assessment questionnaire participants. Second, crawling social media data by creating a suicide-related lexicon, employing existing specific search terms or from verified suicidal users. Data preprocessing is the most important step in this project. It transforms the raw data into an understandable format, as the online data is normally noisy, incomplete, or inconsistent. The most common data preprocessing strategy include text cleaning, stop word removal, segmentation, tokenization, lemmatization, stemming, and manual annotation. Among them, text cleaning is an essential step, and manual annotation is one of the most popular as well as challenging strategies. It is a process of reading a particular pre-selected text and providing additional information in the form of annotations. Not all content containing the word suicide indicates suicidal intent. Even highly topical search terms yield false examples, such as political suicide or suicide attack. Therefore, the annotation is helpful for building a gold standard for identifying content that actually express the suicide ideation. After preprocessing, the next step is the extraction of key features. According to the previous studies, generally, there are 4 features that have been extracted and used to build detection models. First, linguistic features, which basically are the pattern of writing style. Such features extracted by previous study include language structure features, statistical features, and features extracted by applying natural language processing techniques. Second, behavior features, including population behavior and interaction behaviors. Social network analysis can be applied to analyze such features. Emotional features consist of sentiment analysis and emoji analysis. Many studies use sentiment analysis to target the problem of suicide, since emotions are closely related to sentiment. And convenience and conduciveness to emotional expression are the main motivations of use emoji. The last is the account features. This kind of feature is extracted from users' account settings and users' profile information, such as self-description and profile photo. Although published content contains rich information that can identify users with suicide ideation, they might still miss some significant details that could be available from the account features and contribute to higher accuracy. The final step is machine learning modeling. The selected features at this step were often employed to support the application of various machine learning techniques to build the detection model. Machine learning is the process of teaching a computer system to make accurate prediction based on data. Basically, the machine learning techniques can be classified into supervised, unsupervised, and semi-supervised. As shown in this figure, the most popular machine learning techniques in the field were supervised machine learning algorithms. It is called supervised learning because the process of an algorithm learning from the training dataset can be regarded as a teacher supervising the learning process. We know the correct answers. Learning will stop when the algorithm achieves an acceptable level of performance. Since 2018, studies have started exploring the opportunities to apply more complicated techniques to their models, such as unsupervised deep learning-based architectures. One advantage of such deep learning over classical supervised machine learning is the needlessness of feature extractions. Yet, studies also show that with effective features and properly tuned, supervised learning techniques can achieve similar or better performance compared to more complex algorithms. And at the end of this presentation, I also want to bring up the discussion regarding the challenges that we faced in the field. First, the ambiguities and flippant expressions in the online suicidal content. Previous studies have indicated that the complexity and ambiguity of language, as well as the flippant behavior exhibited by non-suicidal individuals, cause approximately 1/4 of the suicidal ideation post to be misidentified. Second, the bias results in the annotation stage remain challenging, as researchers' interpretation of subtle signals in suicidal ideation are likely to be different, given the highly subjective nature of this topic. In addition, it is important to identify whether there are some features with strongest detecting power among all the proposed features, and therefore to improve the accuracy of the detection model. Last but not least, the ethical considerations regarding the development of the detection models. A key issue is the trade-off between users' right regarding their data privacy and the moral imperative to minimize risk. Another important concern is that given the detection models and tools are really 100% accurate, false positives and false negatives become inevitable. In such a scenario, shall we incorporate machine learning algorithms into suicide ideation detection? And that brings us to the end of this presentation. I'd like to thank you for your time and attention today.
Thanks, Cynthia. That was a lot of information and some fairly staggering statistics there. I know I've got a couple of questions I might ask you at the end if we have time. If you wouldn't mind stopping sharing your screen, and I'll introduce our final speaker, Lewis. So finally, we've got Associate Professor Lewis Mitchell from our School of Mathematical Sciences here at the University of Adelaide, Lewis studies how information moves over social networks using mathematical models coupled with data science techniques. His research interests are in computational social science, human dynamics, online social networks, as well as data assimilation and the mathematics of weather and climate. And with that, I will hand over to Lewis.
Thanks, Alexis. So I want to talk about, it's actually not a new method, it's actually kind of an old method, but we're applying it in a new way. I want to talk about entropy and how we've applied that in a couple of different contexts to texts, different sorts of text. So the first one is kind of fun, it's to Marvel movies, and I'll talk about an application to social media as well. So the first challenge is measuring something that should be simple, like measuring the cast size in the Marvel Cinematic Universe movies, which is surprisingly ill-defined, and then looking at how much you can predict about people from their social ties on social networks. So the first thing to tell you is what entropy is. You might have heard about entropy before. It's this idea from thermodynamics, and it's been pulled into information theory since about the 1940s. And it's essentially, you can think of it as a measure of disorder or unpredictability. So a sequence of words, or a collection of things that is very unrepetitive, you would say is highly unpredictable, and so has high entropy, but repeating the same thing over and over again, all work and no play makes Jack a dull boy, again and again, would have low entropy and is highly predictable. So that's the sort of thing. There's some mathematics behind it, but that's basically all you need to know. So the question that we started with was kind of a fun question. We were thinking, what actually makes these Marvel movies that everybody loves so successful? You know, they have these great star powers, they have great special effects and stuff, they have this complicated interlocking story, and they have this increasing scale, right? So the size of the cast of these movies sort of get bigger and bigger over the time, and that's what keeps people hooked into them. So if you want to understand that quantitatively and what makes these things successful, the first thing you need to do is to measure the cast size. So how many characters are there in each movie? That's a simple thing to do, you would think, but it's surprisingly complicated. So here's 3 different ways to do it that all give different results. So the first thing that you might think to do is just read the credits of the movie and look at how many entries there are in the credits of the film, and that gives you the cast size. And so that tells you, you do that, when you look at these movies over time, you see that the third Iron Man movie had the largest cast, and Captain America Civil War had the second highest cast. But then you might say, well, there's a lot of extras and people who don't have names and small characters in the cast list. So let's just look at characters that have names. And if you do that, you get a completely different result. Avengers Infinity War is the largest cast size, has the largest cast size then. And so then you might think, well, okay, maybe not named characters, maybe, but just the number of speaking characters. So that's much more complicated. You have to look at the script now and see which characters actually speak in your film. But you can go and do that. I can get the script of these films and I can analyze them with the computer. And if you do that, you get a different result again. So it's not actually clear from doing these simple approaches, just how this simple question of how many characters are actually in these stories. So there's some care that needs to be taken here. And a solution to this actually comes from ecology. So they have this problem in ecology as well, where they're trying to measure species diversity. So if you've got 2 different populations of species there, which have different proportions of different types of animals, that's different colors in those dots, the community on the left there has got roughly equal participation from each of the different species, roughly equal numbers. And the one on the right is not very diverse at all, actually. It's mainly green animals or green dots in that community. So the thing that the ecologists measure, and the thing that we want to measure about a film, is how much does each character participate in the movie. So how, what's their level of participation? And we want to use that to look at how diverse and how large the effective participating characters size is in the film. So entropy, it turns out, is a tool that allows us to do that. You don't need to understand the mathematics there. It's actually a really old idea. There's nothing new under the sun. This comes from the 1950s that this was first applied. So this is what we decided to do. We did it in a couple of different ways. So first we looked at characters that speak. So we actually got the scripts for all of these films, and we measured how many times they participate in the story through speaking. And then a really novel thing that my colleague Matt Rowan did was he looked at the people's involvement in conflicts. So he did an absolutely insane thing, which was one summer he watched all of the Marvel movies, and he actually wrote down, notated every single punch, every single conflict that happens across these, most of 5,000 hours of films. So, the little clip that you're watching here is one fight scene between Iron Man and Thor, and Captain America comes in later. And the timestamps there tell you every time, Iron Man conflicts with Thor or vice versa, and who wins each conflict. And he did this by hand. Absolutely mad thing to do. A lot of fun for Matt, I guess. And we have this quite wonderful data set of the actual conflicts that happened across each of these 20 odd films. And so the interesting thing that we found from this is using this entropy technique with these unusual data sets, so this number of conflicts in these films, we could actually measure an effective cast size. So the Avengers Infinity War one of the ultimate team up movies at the end of the series, towards the end of the series, had the largest effective cast size, which makes sense because it's one of these team up movies that occur towards the end. And the thing that you notice is that there's appears to be some relationship between the size of the film and how successful it is. So we found this positive relationship with, here it's showing the rating that the movie gets on IMDb. We found a similar sort of relationship with the profitability of the film as well. So, the cast size does tend to be a more higher grossing movie, and one that's rated more highly by the fans. So it doesn't mean that we can solely predict the success of these films based on that. But certainly this entropy tool provides you a useful measure, or a sensible measure of this cast size. So it's applying this idea from ecology and from information theory to a completely unexpected data set, and we get some things that make sense. We can actually do more with this measure, as well as measuring a cast size. We can use this entropy idea to come up with a sense of how similar two different films are. So it's an idea similar to what something like what Ben was doing, was measuring how similar different pieces of text were. Here we were doing this with different similarities in the casts of different films, and we can get some measure of how close each of these different films are. So you can see that there are clusters of Marvel movies that sort of make sense. So the Thor movies cluster together. Here, the Iron Man movies have similar casts, and so they cluster together. And we can use this to sort of map out the landscape of where all these movies sit. So that's kind of a fun application of entropy somewhere in the humanities. The important thing about it is that the information theory here, this entropy measure, provides us with a tool to which we can start to make we can do some quantitative analysis on the sorts of text, on the sorts of data sets that that scientists don't usually think to look at. So when we're talking about digital humanities, what's really exciting to me is that there is this connection between tools and sources of information in wildly different fields that can be brought together to discover stuff that I think is quite interesting. So I like to talk about that because it's kind of fun, and it allows me to introduce this entropy idea. My core business most of the time is looking at social media, like Cynthia was just talking about. I also, like the researcher she was talking about, I also spend a lot of time looking at Twitter. And so the second project here is looking at the application of entropy to the actual text that people write on Twitter, and looking at how much we can predict about individuals based on their social ties, based on the people that they're talking to. So here is another formula that you don't need to understand, but what it is it's a way of measuring this quantity entropy or level of unpredictability based on text. So what we do here is we download an individual's Twitter history, and we line up all those tweets as if they're a big long novel. And then we can calculate this quantity. It's actually an entropy rate. So how unpredictable or predictable is the stream of text that they're talking about. So we get this measure of how many bits of information do you need to predict the next word given the past word. So if I can read everything that I've ever written, how close can I come to predicting the next word out of my mouth? So if I was a very low vocabulary person who just repeated myself all the time, I am, then I would be highly predictable, low entropy, and vice versa. So just to show you, this is a quantitative measure that gives you a number. That number actually kind of makes sense if you apply these entropy estimators to different classic texts. You get things that make sense. So Hemingway is relatively low entropy, sort of simple writing, low vocabulary, right? The Fellowship of the Ring, Tolkien, many more characters, longer, more complicated, in many ways, higher entropy. And apparently my limit for a novel that I read is entropy of 7 bits per word. So I'll never read Ulysses. I'll never get past page 20, and it's good to have a reason a justification for that now. Okay, so what did we do with this? What do we do with this tool? So we applied it to social media. We applied this to Twitter as well. And we actually did a kind of unusual thing. We looked at how much, not how much the level at which you can predict the next word out of my mouth based on the stuff that I'd written. We flipped it on its head and we looked and we asked the question, how much can you predict about an individual based on the stuff that their friends write? So let's say I don't want to be hidden. I don't want to be seen on social media. So I delete my account. But you still know all my friends still remain, right? And you can still read all of their tweets, you can still download them and analyze them. How good a prediction can you make about me based on the stuff that my friends write? So we're just looking at text here, and we're looking at this measure of predictability. So we applied this to lots of different tweets. We looked at at accumulating a number of different friends. I'll zoom in on just one of these many results here. And we looked at the number of friends that you were observing along the x-axis here. We looked at this measure of predictability. So essentially, the inverse of this entropy measure, derived from this entropy measure. And what we found was that once you reached about observing about 9 to 10 of somebody's closest friends, you had enough information in principle to be able to make as good a prediction about that person as if you were reading their tweets themselves. So if I delete my accounts, but you have my 10 closest friends, you in principle can build a machine learning model that can predict the next word out of my mouth as if I was still on the platform. So that's kind of scary. In my last sort of 1 minute, I'll show you that we're applying this to some other data sets as well. So everybody knows about Russian interference in the 2016 US presidential election, which took place on Twitter. All those accounts were taken down, and they had this interesting network structure. So these are these Russian trolls that are trying to spread misinformation. They organized into these sort of coordinating networks. What we're finding is that there are relationships between these different types of trolls. So some of the trolls actually influence each other and pass memes amongst themselves and pass fake news amongst themselves, and then spread it out in this complicated way, and spread it out into the rest of the Twitter sphere. So that's work that's just starting now, but I think is really exciting and promising, and can tell us things about how much people influence each other online, which I think is really important. So there's much more that I could do, many more open problems in this area. I think it's really exciting. This idea of building networks from text is one that there are a lot of mathematical tools that can be brought to bear on that. These conflict networks I talked about with the Marvel cinematic universe, we're interested in looking at how they evolve over time. In related tools, there are things like topic modeling and sentiment analysis, as Cynthia talked about, which we can use to analyze the emotional arcs of stories and things like this. And there's just a lot to do. So I will stop there in the interest of time. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to take questions.
Thanks, Lewis. I just might invite Cynthia and Ben to turn their cameras back on as well, and remind our audience that if you do have a question for any of our speakers, please pop it in the chat window below, and I will have a look and pick those questions up as appropriate. I'm interested. Well, look, there was a lot in those sessions. There was a very vast range of topics. I might just actually flick back to Ben's presentation to begin with, and it actually has a thread that I might pick up with Lewis and Cynthia as well. Can you talk to me a little bit about when you're publishing on your approach? I know your publications have only recently gone out, but have you had any indication of how that has been received? And one of the things I'm particularly interested in is whether these methods you're publishing in sort of the same journals that people with a more literary or traditional approach to authorship detection are publishing, and whether you've got any observations on that.
Yeah, it's interesting. We did. So for the Celius work, I first published the metrical analysis, which is the newest part in a journal that just does this kind of thing, quantitative literary methods. And because it was a methods paper. And that seemed to go pretty well. The reviews were nice. I mean, that's all I can judge so far.
Yeah.
For this, like the full write-up where I had all three methods, but a bunch of stuff that I wasn't able, that doesn't fit this format. So I also did a very extensive going over of the traditional evidence. And so that sent that to a traditional classics journal. And that was the one I was much more scared about, because I didn't know how, like, I'm imagining people wearing tweed jackets and smoking pipes saying, "What is this about machine learning?"
Yeah.
But that actually seemed to go down pretty well. I think they like it when scientists don't barge in waving their computer, and I think they like it when we're a bit more understated when we're presenting our results, because statistical evidence is always probabilistic. There's no certainty in any of these kinds of things, and it's very tempting to overstate one's results. So I mean, I guess if the nature of your question was asking me for a reflection on what makes digital research fit well in traditional fields, that would be what I would say.
Yeah. I might open that question as well to Cynthia and Lewis. I think that one of the things as I do at the moment, trying to work with humanities researchers and people using digital methods in an array of environments, and Lewis, you're a mathematical sciences researcher, is that opportunity for cross-fertilization. And I see that risk that these things can become siloed. And yeah, do you have any observations on that and how publishing patterns might help that, or what your own efforts to cross that bridge a little bit?
Let's see. So yeah, I've got a couple of views there. So the first thing that I'll say is that in terms of publishing, it's only sort of now that there are journals like the one that Ben just mentioned that properly situate themselves between these fields. Like, yeah, publishing some of this stuff over the past 5 to 10 years has been a little bit tricky because there's sort of open access journals, and then there's no journal of computational social science or something until just very recently. So things are moving there, and there's a growing literacy around these sorts of digital techniques and things. The other thing that I'll say is that, I mean, I find that academics sometimes are sort of in our tweed jackets and things like this. And the thing that I always find is that students are way ahead of us on this sort of stuff. They see the potential, and they come up with ideas that are more cross-disciplinary than those of us who have been brought up in the academic tradition necessarily do. So that's evolving rapidly as well. And then the third thing that I'll say, links to Ben's last question. I think the big challenge here really is trustworthiness and explainability in using these techniques. I'm pretty conscious that I just gave you a 10-minute talk that was about a lot of things where I said there's details behind this, but don't worry about it. So I'm not a great representative of that. But a big part of what we do is trying to build trust in these data science approaches and make them explainable and interpretable to people, so that it's not just computer says Celius or computer says Virgil or something, that we can actually explain these things and build confidence in these things. So that's partly an education thing, that's partly a literacy thing, that's partly us building frameworks and approaches that are interpretable and explainable as well.
Thanks, Lewis. And Cynthia, you're probably an example of what Lewis is talking about, in the sense of students who are coming up being in some ways a one-person cross-disciplinary researcher with your panel of supervision that you highlighted to us. Do you have any observations on that experience?
I think regarding that, my main target for my research is just to reaching out to the people and looking for the people with expertise that can help my project. So you can see that's why my supervisory panel combines, involves people from different area with different expertise. And because I'm from the digital humanity background, I would say using the digital technology is always attracting people, because this allows us to not only conduct a more complex analysis, but also allow us to develop applications and tools based on our research, and like actually build up something like helpful in real life. So that's really amazing. But like regarding my own project, I think it's more complicated, because you say I incorporate machine learning, and as I said in my presentation, like the final question is, shall we incorporate like digital technologies or machine learning algorithm into suicide ideation detection? Because suicide even in the humanities area is very complicated issues, and promoting objectivity and improving the accuracy of detections are the key motivators for us to incorporate like digital technologies into this area. But ethically perform machine learning based like research in this area is still an unsettled issue. We still need to like find a pathway out of the dilemma.
Yeah, thank you. I have had one question come through in the chat, and I'll kind of open it up to anybody with a brief comment. What advice do you all have for students to follow in your collective footsteps in the cross-disciplinary nature of DH and related fields? This is a question that I get a little bit in my role here at the library, is people going, I have a specialist interest in this area, but I want to know more about that. What would you suggest a student do?
So for me, I did just a full normal quote unquote classics degree. I had some computer skills from before, but I think the thing that helped me most get into the master's research was acquiring some statistical literacy and just getting your head around the ideas of how to do science with any kind of data. I don't think that you have to be an expert in both fields. I don't consider myself a machine learning expert, but I now know enough to be fairly confident that I'm not misapplying the techniques. And I think that's to me what's crucial. So know your own field and then just get some stats. It's not so hard.
Lewis or Cynthia, did you have anything to say?
I'd agree with that. I mean, yeah, literacy is kind of the key word here, and you know, having events like this and talking with people outside of your field is most people are not all that scary. And you know, I've been thinking about this siloing question a lot recently, and really the silos only exist in our own minds. You know, the universities, there are some slight structural barriers to working across schools and faculties and working outside of these silos, but you know, it's really just that we get familiar with working within our own groups, and you know, there aren't too many impediments to working across disciplines, and most people are pretty nice to talk to, and you'll stop talking to them pretty quickly if they're not.
Yeah. Cynthia, did you have any observations?
Yeah, I think like I just mentioned,
Hi. Yes.
Just looking for and reaching out to the people with expertise from different areas. And also I think it's good to keep an eye on the latest research in your field or in other field. For example, for me, I always use social media as my search terms to search for the latest research. And I would like to see how people analyze such kind of data, because social media basically itself is very like broad area, contains a lot of different topics. So I think it's a good way to do that.
Yeah. Look, we're hit right up on time that we were supposed to be finishing today. I have questions that I could talk to you guys for another hour, and maybe I'll take you out for coffee and get you to do that. And that's the thing, Lewis, as well. You talk to people on campus, and then you build these relationships across the silos, and then they end up asking you to participate in a webinar like this as well. Thank you so much to all of our speakers, and thanks to our attendees for joining us today. As I mentioned at the opening, this is the last in our series of DH Lab events for 2021, but I'm already thinking about our webinar series areas for next year. If you are working on some research or a project that you think would be of interest to this community, please reach out and let me know. I'm really interested in learning about the digital humanities and humanities adjacent research that's happening around our community, both here at the University of Adelaide and in related areas like where Cynthia comes from as well. I'm easy to find on the library website, and I will email you all with the video link after this, so please feel free to get in touch. Thanks everyone for joining us, and have a lovely afternoon.